Hello again, friends. I'm back in your inboxes, on your screens, with another one of my atomic book reports. And this time I'm going to be talking about Chain Reactions, A Hopeful History of Uranium by Lucy Jane Santos. So I came across Lucy. She's a historian, a freelance historian, and I came across her through the British Society for the History of Science, who were very kind enough to do a screening of my film at their conference during the pandemic. It was a virtual screening, but I'd come across Lucy, and I can't remember actually quite now how I knew about this book, but I knew she had written a previous book on the history of radium, which was kind of on my radar to read. And then I saw that she had this new book out about uranium, and obviously that was like really in my wheelhouse. So I ordered it, and I sat down and powered through it a couple of weeks ago, and so I wanted to tell you about it, so you can decide if it's something that you would like to read. So basically, as the title suggests, it's a broad sweep history of the element of uranium, right from when it was sort of discovered. Its properties were beginning to be understood through 20th century, all the way it's been used, and then how the attitudes towards it. And I would say the book really kind of falls into three sections. There's the sort of early years, basically through till the atomic bombs are dropped at the end of the Second World War. Then there's the kind of middle section of the book, which is really all about the kind of post-war atomic uranium fever, atomic euphoria. That's really sort of my bag. That was really what drew me to this book. That was I did loads of research in that sort of area for my own film, and there was even more things that were new to me here. And then the last section of the book, to be honest, I found it was a little bit strange. I mean, the clue is in the name. It's a hopeful history of uranium, but the final chapter takes a bit of a swerve really for me. It moves away from being a history to being really like an advocacy book arguing for an expansion of nuclear power, which obviously is fine. We all have different views on that, but it just sat a little bit weirdly to me on the end of this sort of social history. So generally, I have really enjoyed the middle section of the book, so I want to spend most of my time talking about that. Say a little bit about the earlier section and my thoughts on that, and I had a few reservations about the sort of end of the book, so I'll touch on those first. So yeah, the first section goes through the very earliest chapter. Actually was really interesting. It's from the starts off in sort of 16th century Bohemia, kind of modern day Czechia, Germany, in these the silver mines in the mountains there, with this sticky black ore that they called pechblende, and that basically was uranium oxide. And she takes us through how various, I guess, like metallurgists, researchers, independent scientists in the 16th, 17th century began to research this stuff and its properties. Miners were getting sick for various reasons, including the radiation from this pechblende, we now know. And they isolated uranium. Was sort of officially discovered as a new metal. New applications were discovered as the radioactive properties were beginning to be understood. So you had, like you always get, first thing you get kind of like crazy medical applications. So there was like uranium salts, uranium wine, purported to have all these amazing health benefits. Diabetes was going to be cured with uranium. But you also had early photographic techniques. Obviously, big one is X-rays. And then really we get into the story of nuclear fission and the steps, the scientific discoveries and steps towards the atomic bomb. After we got away from the sort of pechblende and the very early stuff, I did find the first bit of this book a bit dry, to be honest. It was very factual. It's very deeply researched. I think the bibliography is like 8 pages, pages and pages of footnotes. But that first section to me it's very factual. She's packing a lot in, and I get that. Like that, I had this issue with my own film. You can't go broad and deep, right? So to get through the story, she was having to rushed through, and so you didn't really get much of a sense of the people or the sort of colour of the time. It felt almost like an extended Wikipedia article or something. But one thing I will say that I did really appreciate was that she really made a point of flagging up some of the women scientists who don't always get, given their credit. So obviously, big famous name, Marie Curie, Lisa Meitner, pretty well known. But also she mentioned a German chemist called Ida Noddack, who I didn't know. And also she talked about the only woman physicist on Enrico Fermi's team in Chicago when they built the first ever atomic pile, who was called Leona Woods, who I had not heard of. So I appreciated that. And I guess on a similar vein, she also, all the way through the book, actually, not just in that first section, definitely made a point of talking about Indigenous people and lands and how those have been impacted by uranium, through the decades. So she talked about the Trinity test site, and it's often not, this is a part of their story that's left out. I mean, a case in point would be the Oppenheimer film, Christopher Nolan film, really barely mentioned that there was people living on this land of the Nevada test site and the impacts on them. Later on in the book, she mentions a big nuclear accident which happened actually a few months after 3 Mile Island, which was a big uranium spill in Church Rock, New Mexico. But this was basically a Navajo town. It did not get very much coverage, but it was a major incident. And again, I think there's some kind of environmental racism really going on throughout this story. And I appreciated that she made a point of talking about some of those stories. And then at the back end of the book, as I say, it took this kind of turn into arguing for a big expansion of nuclear power. That's fine. We all have a view on that. I just found some of her arguments not like that convincing, really. So she talks, there's a lot of familiar talking points, really, that the nuclear power industry has kind of been in the doldrums since 3 Mile Island because of these accidents and people's kind of overreaction to those accidents and sort of irrational fears of nuclear and radiation. It's just not an argument that I really buy. I think that it's economics is why, over and over again through those last sort of 4 decades, that nuclear has not achieved the levels that were hoped. And she just doesn't touch on that at all. And also there was a few things that she kind of minimised radioactive waste. She calls it a supposed issue. I mean, it is an issue. Outside of Scandinavia, like the US, the UK, they do not have a location for the radioactive waste that's been produced over the last many decades. Technically, okay, like it's not an insurmountable challenge, but that's sort of not the point. Like, it's a social, political, economic challenge of which we have not yet met. So I think it's to kind of disregard that. I'm a bit troubled by that. And then the biggest issue really that I had with that, it's mentioned at the end of the book, also mentioned earlier on in passing. It's a little bit, it's quite controversial, and maybe it's a bit sort of technical, but basically she's very disparaging about something called the LNT model, the linear non-threshold model of radiation. It's the underpins the whole of radiation protection basically around the world. My partner is actually a medical physicist, so this is his job, dealing with radiation protection. I'll talk to him a little bit about it. I mean, it's the consensus, I suppose, in the same way that there is a global scientific consensus on man-made climate change. The LNT is the scientific consensus about radiation. Some people believe that it's wrong and that there is this threshold beneath which there's a safe level of radiation. The issues really, I suppose, is that even if that is true, it's hard to prove one way or the other, but also practically, where do you draw that line? How would you practically manage it? It would introduce so many uncertainties and difficulties that they're all around the world since the 50s. This is the model. When she introduces the model, she calls it a flawed model, and later at the end she repeats this kind of talking point that this flawed model has led to kind of excessive, onerous safety regulations in the nuclear industry, and that is the sort of, that's one of the problems that it struggled with, again, I don't find that very convincing. And also, it's just she footnotes that I looked up what the sourcing for that was, and it's this one article by one Canadian engineering guy who seems to work for, or he's on the board of a kind of contentious sounding organisation that also like lobbies against regulations on chemicals and big tobacco, and I don't know, it's a bit of a fringe argument, and it sort of seemed a bit out of place in this book. But your mileage may vary on these arguments. I just thought it was a bit odd on the end of what's actually a really interesting social history to suddenly go off into this area. But the title is A Hopeful History, so but really what I want to talk mostly about is the sort of heart of this book. And actually for me, I could have quite happily lost the earlier parts and the last part and just really gone in more detail on this central section, because I think this is really where Lucy was on her strongest ground. Her background was she's done previous work on the history of like cosmetics. As I mentioned, the previous book on radium. These kind of like the social and the social and cultural manifestations of this kind of euphoria and excitement are really fascinating, and she found some really great examples. One thing I would have loved more was there are a few photographic plates in the middle, but there's not that many. Maybe this is a rights issue. It's expensive to clear some of these things, I know. I imagine it's the same in publishing. It would have been great to have some more pictures. But yeah, she basically, the guts of the book really, or the bit I most enjoyed, was this post-war. The 3 chapters in the middle of the book are called Atomic Predictions, Uranium Fever and Atomic Cities. So really after the Second World War and the bombs, we get into this kind of excitement about what can atomic science be used for. And also, like, interacting with sort of propaganda issues. I mean, this is what really crossing over with my film, where, there was a big push to get people to feel more comfortable with atomic things, and also to almost like rehabilitate America because they had dropped the atomic bomb. And actually, one of the first things that she talks about sort of relates to that. I thought this was really interesting. I have heard of, she talked about this substance called various names: crater glass, atomsite, also known as Alamogordo glass, or this is the name I've heard of, trinitite. She says this is a glassy mineral that was created by the intense heat of the explosion of the Trinity test reacting with the sand. The heat liquefied the sand, and when it cooled and solidified, there was a new substance. The majority of trinitite created was a greenish colour, but there are also varieties of red, which contained material from the copper wires of the bomb itself, and a very rare black form, which is believed to have been fused where the tower had stood. And then she goes on to talk about some jewellery that was made out of this trinitite that was worn by models and actresses. And it says, it can be described as a jeweller's conception in miniature of an actual atomic explosion mushrooming skyward atop a pillar of cloud, leaving glassy green devastation behind. And then she goes on to say that it was specifically propaganda is also made explicit by some of the covering reports who agreed that the fact that atomsite was safe to wear would refute the Japanese claims that it is radioactive long after an atomic explosion. This was before the publication of the famous report by John Hersey from Hiroshima that really laid bare the devastating physical impacts of the atomic bombs. Before that, it was, I didn't really know this, but really interesting in this book, it was quite a sort of jokey tone in American sort of popular cultural conversations around it until that book came out, and then I think that the tone did shift. So we sort of move on. Probably my favourite chapter was the uranium fever. We get into kind of these crazy uranium prospectors. Again, some mad health stuff, which I'll get onto in a second. But books and movies and board games. The uranium prospecting sort of craze was really, really fascinating. She talks about on Lucille Ball demonstrating how a Geiger counter worked on her TV show. And she also describes this great sounding Life magazine article with a photo shoot, which again, this I would have loved to see the picture of this, and I'm sure it's online. I probably should look it up. But she says the family in the photographs are depicted against a fake backdrop of mountains and cactuses, dressed in what Life referred to as prospecting duds. The father is seen sporting a stylish black outfit with red breast pockets, collar, and a cap, exuding a sense of sartorial flair. The mother takes centre stage in the feature, clad in a bright orange jumpsuit referred to as the U-235. That's the chemical name for uranium. Complete with a perfectly coiffed hair and a shovel in hand. And the daughter dons a smaller version of the mother's outfit known as the Diggerette Junior. These uranium prospectors, it kind of literally was the new gold rush. I mean, they were making like huge amounts of money. She talks about shares that were being introduced in all these uranium prospecting companies. You have people becoming uraniumaires, like millionaires, sort of like big sums of money, and you got the boom towns. So Moab and Grants, New Mexico, became like big sites for uranium prospecting. And there's a great little detail about Grants. Almost overnight, it experienced a population boom as it transformed from the carrot capital of the world to the uranium capital of the world. And then other bits that I thought were really super interesting was so she had talked in her previous book, I imagine, about the radium craze, the sort of health craze, the idea that radon gas was good for your health, and people would go and sit in mines to like breathe in this radon gas, and you get a sort of similar thing with the health benefits of uranium. It says there were other options, including tunnels, sitting houses, and uranatoriums. In Texas, there was something called the Uranium Trail, which consisted of 25 different sitting houses. And it said that the treatment methods varied between businesses. Jessie Reese, who's somebody she met previously had talked about, had a chair filled with uranium dirt. Some places had benches filled with soil, while others had shallow troughs where customers buried their bare feet in the dirt. Certain establishments offered complete immersion while lying down. At Frank and Annie's, customers sat with sacks filled with uranium sand on their heads and shoulders, and their feet in troughs while their hands were placed in cardboard boxes with sand. And people were paying like loads of money for this, and people were getting rich. I mean, I suppose it was ever thus, right? Sort of crazy health crazes. But there's just like reams and reams of really really great, deeply researched stuff here. Just really interesting. To see the America's #1 athlete foot relief. She moves on to talk about radioisotopes, obviously, which do have actual genuine medical applications. But it was great to take you back to that period of time when like it was all up in the air. And I guess the general public didn't know what was what really, but it was just this like super exciting time. And then the chapter after this, Atomic Cities, I also really enjoyed. She talks about Oak Ridge, who I talked about in the previous book report that I did, but Vegas, which was not that far from the testing ground. Nevada became like a real uranium state, and there's loads of great details in here about Vegas, the bomb shelter craze. She talks about duck and cover, which is pretty well known. But there was just then we move on to the nuclear testing. Again, I appreciated how she talks at some length about the Marshall Islanders. She talks about bikini and wear, the kind of cultural idea of the bikini. But of course, that comes from the Bikini Islands and the Bikini Atoll and the nuclear tests. So yeah, basically, it's just that whole middle section. I feel like it's really fun to read, and it's like a window on this post-war kind of time of optimism. And I really recommend this book for that middle section. I've just read a few little examples there, but all in all, that was very fun to read and really illuminating. Although I would have liked more pictures. The earlier section, I think, if you want to know really about the history of how the atomic bomb came about, there's probably better places to do that. I mean, the Richard Rhodes classic book, the title escapes me, How to Build an Atomic Bomb, maybe The Making of an Atomic Bomb. That's terrible. I should remember the name of that. Richard Rhodes, that's a classic. But there are countless histories. This, it's a good sort of surface overview. And yeah, the final section, you know, your mileage will vary, I think, on whether you agree with her conclusions. I sort of didn't really. I didn't find it very convincing, but it didn't detract altogether from my enjoyment of the book. So I think overall I would say it's like a thumbs up with some reservations for Chain Reactions, A Hopeful History of Uranium. So anyway, I would love to hear if you do read this, or if you got any other books that you think I should read and talk about. Before I go, it would be remiss of me not to mention, while we're talking of atomic things, my brand new film club, the Film Thread, which we are sort of launching right now. First season is on atomic movies. I announced the first film yesterday, The Day the Earth Caught Fire, which is a really brilliant early 1960s British sci-fi movie about nuclear tests gone catastrophically wrong. And there's 50% off if you sign up before the end of July. So I'd love to see you in the Film Thread. And I hope you enjoyed my book report, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks, guys.